I've had the opportunity to speak at Patriot Academy down in Austin a couple of times in the past, and hope to do it again in the future. Big fan of everything that you guys do, especially. One of the things that I realized the first time I went, and I talked about it nonstop once I got back home to anybody who would listen, is, hey man, there are actually young people in the country who know something about something, anything about anything, which at this point really feels like an accomplishment. The guys who are coming to Patriot Academy are so impressive. The thing that struck me the most that first year, and it was just seeing how really it's the students at the academy who are running the shop. They have oversight and guidance, of course, from their instructors, but it's obvious that you've built up a lot of institutional knowledge among the student base over time. It's really fun to watch them go in there and take charge and lobby and push for their legislation and work the process. And so hats off to you guys. It's a really amazing thing. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I had an acoustic guitar, $25 to my name, and thought it'd be a good idea to move to LA where I'd never met anyone. And so you're so much further, every person at Patriot Academy is so much further along in life than I was at your age. It's a real pleasure to watch you guys do the things that you do. Oh, this is the finest cigar that has ever been smoked on planet Earth, a Monte Cristo Añejado, which means basically aged. It's an old cigar. They age it about 8 to 10 years before they put it out in the world. I told Rick before the show started, what I really want to do is stick to Q&A. I can speech and pontificate, but I don't see how that's going to do anyone any good. I'd really like to be responsive, hear what you guys are thinking about, what's on your minds and hearts, and see if there's any of it that I can speak to or help you out with or answer, shed some light on. I'm not sure if you heard, as Rick was sort of outlining my bio, but I'm the COO and founder of the Daily Wire and the Ben Shapiro Show. Live here in Los Angeles. The Ben Shapiro Show, of course, the biggest conservative podcast in the country, listened to or seen by over 1 million people a day. 2 other shows that we produce, the Andrew Klavan Show and the Michael Knowles Show, both live daily shows with significant audiences. If you haven't seen those guys, they're terrific. Andrew, a very well-known, successful, best-selling author for many years of sort of hard-boiled fiction and also screenplays, has had a great career and is a cultural figure. Hearing his opinions on culture and politics and religion, always very sort of interesting, different than what your sort of normal, maybe Fox News fare. And Michael Knowles, who is a young guy himself, 25 years old, I think, and had the best-selling book in the world at one point last year called Reasons to Vote for Democrats. It was 216 blank pages, so sort of the perfect book for the era of Trump. And then the Daily Wire, which is our web publication. We have about 100 million page views every month, just covering basic conservative news and commentary. Ben Shapiro there, the editor-in-chief, so a lot of, if you've ever read much of Ben's work, in addition to seeing him or hearing him, most of his work appears on our site. We have a great staff of writers who are, we think, an important part of the fight, who come to work every day and compile information, put it out to where people can get their hands on it. It's harder and harder now with all the tech companies being sort of aligned against us, but we're still reaching a lot of people every day with conservative content. So that's kind of who I am. Before that, I was a filmmaker. I made a little movie called The Arroyo and a few others over the years. Had some good Hollywood adventures. I ran an organization called Friends of Abe, which is about 2,500 actors and directors and gaffers and grips and makeup artists, people working in Hollywood who have conservative values, feel that they don't have a lot of opportunity to express themselves or be sort of open about who they are in the industry. And so we had an organization that would give those people an opportunity to make friends and really just have fellowship, sort of like a cross between church and Alcoholics Anonymous. Everybody has to come and confess that they're conservative, sort of, hey, I'm Jeremy and I'm a conservative. And, oh, yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Welcome, Jeremy. But over the years, we've had the opportunity in that organization to host all the luminaries. So Rick, let's jump into some questions.
I was just wondering on the Hollywood side, is that kind of, have you moved on from that, or is that still going? Is there still a Friends of Abe or something like that happening? And how are all the conservatives responding to the mass chaos of the Me Too movement?
Yeah. So Friends of Abe, because it's such a loosely knit sort of community of people. I mean, it always exists. It's not as formally organized now as it has been in the past. I think that in the beginning of the Trump administration, it was a very difficult time for conservatives. You know, when Hollywood's in a good mood, when a Democrat's in the White House, they're a lot more friendly, I think, to our members. And when you have a Republican in the White House, things just get a little more tense. That's not to say that conservatives aren't actively working in the industry right now. They are in many places. But I think when the president was elected, when he was inaugurated, a lot of people felt like they needed to keep their heads down more than usual at that time. And so it took a little bit of the wind out of our sails organizationally. But I hear from people every day who are doing great things in the industry. People are doing, great work. People who were nominated last night, if you watched the Academy Awards, and I know you didn't, because let's face it, no one did. But there were people who were there, who were representing, and so it is a little different than it's been in the past, but it's still a very vibrant community of conservatives here in the industry.
All right, so let's see, guys. You guys can type your questions into the attendee chat. We had a couple of questions on the whole Second Amendment thing. Yeah. What you think the outcome of this is going to be. Do they have more momentum, the anti-Second Amendment folks, than they had in, the Sandy Hook situation, or do you think it's similar to that and will simmer down at some point, and people will stop thinking emotionally and start thinking logically again?
I think this is the most dangerous moment for the Second Amendment in my lifetime, and it's on the one hand because of the momentum that they have. The media has made a decision that they're going to play this thing out by elevating the drama club kids from Parkland. I think that they've really they've sort of given themselves the excuse to cover this in a way that they haven't covered past episodes of gun violence or mass shootings. But that's not really why this is the most dangerous moment. It is a horrible moment, and you can see it reflected in the polls that people are really there's a radical swing in the polls against gun owners at the moment. But the real problem is that we have a president who I don't think has very strong core convictions in favor of gun rights. I don't want to badmouth our president, but he's a coastal guy, right? He was born in New York. He grew up, lived most of his life, all of his working life in New York. He has spent time in Hollywood, but always a coastal guy, the elite of the elite, a billionaire. He isn't particularly conversant on gun rights. He hasn't spent a lot of time around people who are, there's this interesting sort of paradox, which is the NRA endorsed Donald Trump faster than they've endorsed any previous Republican candidate for the presidency. And yet, even before he became president, during the election, Donald Trump pushed hard against the NRA to get them to soften their view on the no-fly list applying to gun owners. Basically, if a person's on the no-fly list, that they could have their right to own a weapon temporarily suspended. Which, can you imagine if a Democrat had proposed that, how the NRA and conservatives would have united against it? But here in the instance of President Trump, or Donald Trump seeking the presidency, the NRA supported him wholeheartedly, went along with that. So the first president who's pushed the NRA off a position that I can ever remember in my lifetime was the one that they were the fastest to endorse in Donald Trump. And so now that same man who revealed that same impulse is the president. And he obviously, like all of us, is mortified by what happened in Florida, mortified by the few instances of mass shootings that have happened on his watch, wants to do something about it. You see, that's the real problem for conservatism. The biggest problem for conservatism is that when you have power, you naturally want to use that power.
Right.
And so this is why even Ronald Reagan famously didn't shrink the government, right? Because the purpose of government power isn't to erode government power. The purpose of government power is to express government power. So you have the president, like all of us, wants to do something about this terrible occurrence that we have in our country of mass shootings, and in particular shootings at schools. And he has the power to do it. He has the pulpit from which to advocate for certain ideas, but he doesn't have the sort of core foundational values about guns that we typically see in Republican presidents or
which was seen, of course, in his comments, if reported correctly, that even using the language, "I'd rather take the guns before they use them," made that pretty clear. And so it sounds like you might be concerned that he could be pushed the wrong direction on this thing, as public opinion and as even some of the people around him maybe. While the people around him have been really strong on religious liberty and I think influenced him in the right direction on that, I'm not sure he has the really strong constitutional, especially on the Second Amendment guys, that would keep him strong on this as all of these discussions are taking place. Sounds like you have the same fear.
Interestingly, I was in the West Wing a little over a week ago. It was on the day that the president hosted some of the parents and survivors from the shooting in Florida and met with, I won't name names, but about as high-ranking officials in the administration as it's possible to meet with. And one of the things that I cautioned them about was the fact that they aren't exposed routinely to people like me, people from Texas, people who grew up in gun culture. And I said to them, because they outlined some of the things they were thinking about, banning bump stocks, raising the age to 21 to purchase a so-called assault rifle, comprehensive universal background checks, closing gun show loopholes and things of this nature. And one of the things that I said to them is, you need to spend some time, not just around lobbyists. Because the problem wasn't Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA. I don't know him. I respect him. I love what the NRA does. But at the end of the day, he lives in the same bubble that all sort of representatives live in. He is the representative of the members of the NRA. And the temptation when you're a representative is to believe that you are the NRA. You are the 6th precinct from whatever state you're from, that because they elected you and you routinely speak on their behalf, that they follow you instead of expecting you to follow them.
Yeah.
So I think Wayne LaPierre, who of course is a great advocate for gun rights, but I think that he's in a difficult position of probably thinking that he can make deals with the president and forgetting a little bit that not everybody is in the same headspace that he's in. So I said, you need to spend time, and the president needs to spend time with people who are just folk who grew up in gun culture. I said, because there's a continuum that I don't think you're fully aware of as a coastal family, and that is and I said, I could have told you this when I was 5 years old. It's so central to gun culture. The continuum looks like this. You have a gun to guard against government tyranny. You don't have a gun to hunt. You don't even really have a gun for self-defense. You have a gun to guard against government tyranny. The definition of government tyranny is when they come to take your gun.
Right.
So the only reason you have a gun is to stop something which can be reduced to them trying to take your gun. I said, the average person who believes that their gun guards against tyranny, they don't really believe that they have a gun to maintain their right to representation in Congress. They don't really believe that they have their gun to maintain their right to vote at all. They don't believe that they have everything about what tyranny looks like is subjective, except for one thing. If they come to take your gun, it's tyranny. That's why you had the gun in the first place. I said, so the problem you face is that when you do things that seem very practical to you, or things that you've talked to some Republicans in Congress or some lobbyists over here, and you think maybe we can agree on these issues, what you're missing is when you encroach on gun rights, you are reinforcing the belief among gun owners that caused them to own their guns in the first place. Yeah. And that can create a death spiral, I think, for the administration if they're not very, very careful.
I'd love your thoughts on the optics of these kids, because I watched one last night. Unfortunately, I watched the 2 kids on with Bill Maher, which is anytime I have to watch Bill Maher is a bad evening. But so I'm watching this thing and I'm thinking, okay, everything they're saying is extremely shallow, and they've got their one-liners down for, we just want to save kids, and I've been on the receiving end of this, even though I don't know what part of the school they were in, if they were even in the same building as where the shooter was, but none of that really matters on the optics. But they're 17, they're extremely flippant and rude and disrespectful of even Congress, the president, the positions, the whole 9 yards. I mean, to me, it really bothers me the way they present themselves. They use the F word on television. I mean, it's crazy, but yet the world is just loving them. And of course, Bill Maher was really loving them. How do you think they're doing? I mean, are they winning people over?
Yes, they are winning people over. It's a mixed bag. It's like everything else in our culture right now. They're polarizing people. So for people in the gun community, for example, people in very red counties or red states, they're probably polarizing them even more. I mean, there's an argument to be made electorally that the best thing that could happen right now is the Democrats could really push hard for some sort of major encroachment on gun rights. Let's see how that does for them in the midterms, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that Republicans have a real problem, and Donald Trump in particular has a real problem with two important groups, millennials and white working class women. And, one of those is always a problem for Republicans. Young people very rarely are Republican, but typically married white women break for for Republicans. I'm sorry, that's a fairly faithful constituency for Republicans. They are turning against Donald Trump in droves long before this shooting. So not because of this shooting. I think because of some of the aesthetics around his presidency, because of the way he is such a pugilist, because of the way that he seems to sort of relish in poking people, his sort of loose attachment at times to the truth, which is sometimes very gratifying to those of us in the trenches, right? We're glad there's a guy who wants to fight, a guy who sort of doesn't suffer, doesn't take guff. But I think that for married women in particular, they see that sometimes as very offensive. But since the shooting, I think that they now have an easy excuse, and especially because of the kids being on TV, sort of championing this thing. They have a real excuse to let their support for Republicans go. If that happens, it's a major loss. And even though young people don't typically vote Republican, it's a real challenge now because millennials, I think, are the largest voting demographic. I mean, it's an enormous number of kids right now who are coming of age, or have only recently come of age, who wield an incredible amount of power if they choose to wield it electorally. So I think it's a very dangerous moment for gun owners. Dangerous because we have a president who I think is going to encroach on our rights. How much will he? I think we're all hopeful it won't be much, but he for very good reasons wants to do something, and because he's not a Second Amendment guy in his bones, probably will do something. And a very dangerous moment because the mood not of the country is turning against us, but in particular the mood of sort of the only women that we traditionally do well with electorally are also abandoning us.
Key constituencies. In other words, I mean, the polling may still look good for us if most people are blaming the sheriff's department and whatnot, and not the gun. But if those key constituencies that the campaigns will be looking at are moving, then the people in Washington will move.
And listen, you brought up the kids using foul language and stuff on TV. The left loves it when kids use foul language.
Yeah.
If you think of all the major political moments that have happened in the last, I don't know how old this phenomenon is, but I would say in the last 8 years, an enormous component in every major political moment is viral video of kids, sometimes kids as young as like 5, using the harshest profanity possible. The left relishes it for some reason. And I think the reason is because it's children acting like adults.
Yeah.
And so much of what the left believes is childlike. And so to see children functioning as though they were adults who could make reasonable, responsible choices along those same value lines really excites them. And so this is one of their new tricks. And, it's offensive to you. I think it really works well for them. It's a real rallying point for them.
Right. Hey, this one may not have been on your radar, but one of the things I've noticed that's been lost in this gun bill was the national reciprocity bill of Congressman Hudson out of North Carolina, which we almost had that through, and frankly, some of my friends that are not NRA, but some of the even more conservative gun groups out there killed it, unfortunately, because they didn't like the fix NICS part of the bill. I thought it was a good trade. I wanted it to happen because I thought national reciprocity was the most important thing we could do. In the last 10 years.
And the president in particular spoke against it during that meeting last week.
Oh, he did. So you think that's probably gone at this point?
The president pretty much just shut it down. if I'm not mistaken, I believe that Rep. Scalise brought it up, and the president said something to him like, you don't have any bigger fan than me. I know what you've been through, but this is a bad idea, and I'm not for it.
Man,
Listen,
yeah.
as a Californian, you can imagine how much I would like to see national reciprocity.
Yeah, no doubt for you guys. Huge. Okay, so one of our folks asked, where did you find Ben Shapiro? Like, how does a guy like that, come out of nowhere and suddenly, become such a national phenomenon, especially for millennials, who I think are the cool thing I like about this too, Jeremy, is people are learning, right? They're not just riled up by what Ben does. They're learning. They're actually listening, because he's not. What I love about he's not like, I'm kind of a dancing chicken, right? I mean, I get up there and I put on the whole show and all that.
Yeah.
He just, it's just data at 100 miles an hour, and I would have never thought so many millennials would pay attention and actually learn from that, but they are. So how did that all happen? Kind of how did you help to launch his national stage to be even bigger? And who do we have in the wings that are kind of coming behind him that are like him? Do we have a whole crop of good? You mentioned a couple of the guys. I forget the 25-year-old you said is part of y'all's team, but give us some of that view of what's coming as well.
Yeah. So a lot of sort of disputed opinions about this. Was Ben Shapiro hatched? Was he grown in a laboratory, assembled in a factory? No one is completely sure. I encountered Ben for the first time 8 or 9 years ago. We were introduced, sort of in a funny roundabout way. A mutual friend, Mark Masters, who ran at the time the largest private talk radio network in the country, who employed Ben, and who I was working with on sort of helping him shepherd some ideas in Hollywood, introduced us. And what's funny about that is the person who introduced Ben to Mark and the person who introduced me to Mark is the same person. And Mark lives in Oregon, but the person who made those two introductions lives here, where Ben and I both live in LA, and that's the late Andrew Breitbart. So Andrew did not introduce Ben and I, but he introduced Ben to Mark and me to Mark, and Mark from Oregon came back to LA and introduced Ben and I. So it's a pretty roundabout kind of way of the two of us meeting. Andrew actually sort of helped Ben kickstart his career when Ben was 17 or 16, I believe maybe 16. He was at UCLA, had skipped 2 grades, and he started writing rebuttals to some opinion pieces in the Daily Bruin that sort of evolved to him writing a column for the Daily Bruin. And when he was 17, he asked his father, "Do you think I'm good enough to appear in actual, non-campus newspapers?" His dad sent his work off to a company called Creators Syndicate, and Ben became the youngest syndicated columnist in the country at that time at 17 years old, syndicated in newspapers and on websites around the country. Andrew Breitbart had actually picked up a copy of the Daily Bruin early on and seen Ben's writing and taken Ben out for coffee and talked to him about, what do you want to do? How can I help? And over the years was a mentor to the two of us, to both of us. So when I met Ben, he was practicing as an attorney for Talk Radio Network. He had been writing his column all along, all throughout Harvard Law, and he had written a couple of books, some of them bestsellers, during the time that he was in college and at law school, but he hadn't really become a face. He had a little radio show in Orlando, Florida that he did from LA once a week. It was a weekend show. And he actually asked me to guest host for him once, which was a real kick for me to get to do, because I'd done some radio as a young guy too. But I saw right away that Ben had something special to offer. He's a 150 IQ guy. He's read every book and remembers everything he's ever read. He reads 3 books a day, and 3 books a week, and not in the way that some people who say they read a lot of books, they read the first chapter and the last chapter and kind of skim in between and see if anything stands out. Ben reads every word of 3 books a week and remembers every word of 3 books a week. And something happens to you, I think, once you cross like the 1,000 book mark, you just know everything. And that was already true of Ben, even when I met him nearly a decade ago. So he and I worked together on a few small projects here and there. His sister came down to Texas and helped me when I was shooting my film, The Arroyo, and our friendship really took off. About 5 years ago, we decided to start a real venture together, and it took the form of a website for the David Horowitz Freedom Center called Truth Revolt. Ben was the editor-in-chief, and I was sort of the managing editor. And at that time, I'd been doing a lot of video work. I had started doing videos for a great conservative commentator named Bill Whittle. I was doing some of the early PragerU videos at that time.
I remember Bill. I met him at your gathering when I came out and did that Constitution class for you. I forget the guy's was the dude from Chuck. What's his name?
Yeah, Zachary Levi.
Yeah, it was his place where you had that meeting, and I met Billy. And I remember that night he gave me a DVD of a talk he did on the Declaration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bill's terrific. I had produced that content that he gave you that night. So I, as part of our Truth Revolt venture, I said to Ben, we got to get you on camera. We need to get your face out there some more. And I started creating a plan for how to make Ben famous, because I thought everyone needs to hear what this guy has to say. He's an important voice in the movement. And we ran into so much opposition, because there's a real generation divide with Ben. People over 40 often don't know who he is. People 35 and under see him as sort of many see him as the most important figure in the movement. So, what we would get as feedback from a lot of, people over 40 was, Ben talks too fast. You'll never be able to build a national audience. He's got to slow it down. In other words, he basically needs to become a Sean Hannity type, or he needs to become a Fox News type personality. And we worked on that, and it was never really convincing when Ben would go slow. I would slow him down. It didn't work. It wasn't who he was. And so a day came when we decided, we're going to keep making these videos. At that time, we were making videos with him. Let's let Ben be Ben, and let's put a lot of marketing power behind him. Our time at Truth Revolt came to an end, and we met with our partner, Caleb Robinson, who's become our partner in the venture here, Daily Wire. And with his help, we met with a family who gave us a great opportunity financially, and we started Daily Wire and the Ben Shapiro podcast. The first episodes of Ben's podcast were actually shot in my garage.
Wow.
Here we are 30 months later, 1 million people listen to the show every single day, and we don't, we let Ben be Ben. So he's, his talent is, I think, very unique. His mind is unique. His capacity is unique. And we put a good plan in place around him, a good marketing plan in place that's allowed him to, I think I'm one who does believe he's one of the most important voices in the movement.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. That is so interesting how that all came about. By the way, I think of all the different productions he's done and the different videos, by far the most important that I agreed with absolutely 110% was his total smackdown and takedown of the last Star Wars movies. It was just, it was perfect. It was spot on.
Priorities.
Priorities. So interesting what you described as kind of the style of communication and how people wanted that to change, and even that was your gut instinct to try to slow him down or whatever. What would you say to our viewers tonight from Patriot Academy, these young leaders that also want to impact in different ways about being themselves, but also honing their craft? I mean, that's an interesting balance to find, because I would have thought the exact same thing. I would have tried to remake Ben to fit all these other communication modes. But man, I mean, being himself has definitely been the right call.
So we did remake Ben in a few ways, and I think that is important to say. First, we tested Ben for as highly, highly intelligent as he is, for being, not suffering fools lightly. He's really a very humble guy. He's open to criticism. He's open to feedback. All those times I tried to slow him down, he slowed down. He tested it. He tried. It didn't work. One of the first things that I did early on, even before Ben and I were working together, is I took a stylist over to his house, and we, along with his wife, went through his closet, and we threw away 90% of all the clothing that he owned. Because at that time, Ben sort of dressed a lot of like Harvard Law sweatshirts and kind of, age-worn, faded jeans, and he didn't look camera ready. He looked like a guy who stayed behind the scenes and wrote. And he allowed me to do that. I mean, we threw away his entire wardrobe and invested thousands of dollars buying him more camera-ready clothing. And I just told him, I said, listen, you have to make modifications. You have to practice your craft. You've done the intellectual work, and that's the most important thing. A lot of people approach me, they want to be the next Ben Shapiro. And what Ben told me one day, and I've come to see it as completely true, is, all these kids who want to be me don't want to do what I did. When they say, how can I be like you? Ben's first thing that he says to them is, read every single book.
Yeah.
Read all of them. And people get very discouraged because they're like, well, but I'm not a fast reader. That could take me 10 years. And Ben's like, well, how long do you think it took me?
Yeah.
It took me 10 years to be an overnight success. Ben is so good because he has done the work. And to your point, he's put in the work intellectually. He has put in the work presentationally, but we've both been open to the idea of, we test ideas, and if they don't work, we test new ideas. So some of them, wardrobe, tested, the idea worked. Other ideas, slow him down, we tested, it didn't work. He wasn't authentic. I think what the media, especially modern media, craves the most is authenticity from people.
Yeah.
George W. Bush, elected to the presidency twice, authentic. Sarah Palin, during her time as the nominee for VP, helped John McCain's numbers go up. Why? Because she may be there's a kind of hokiness, perhaps. But she is who she is. You knew what you were getting, and people really connect to that. They really respond to that. It's so refreshing, especially in media and politics. Mitt Romney, by contrast, great man, ethical man. Maybe not as conservative as I would like, but certainly one of the finest men ever to seek the presidency, in my opinion. But not particularly authentic. I don't feel like any of us thought we knew the real Mitt Romney throughout his decades of public service. We could never say we really know the real Mitt Romney. And so I think conservatives in particular, millennials especially, people want, they crave that authenticity. And I think Ben, with all of his quirks and foibles and idiosyncrasies, is an authentic Ben. So people really respond to it.
Well, just for the record, Jeremy, anytime you want to come to Dripping Springs and go through my closet and throw out as much of you want, as long as you are also planning to spend thousands of dollars for, making me look better. I'm all for it, bro. Anytime.
That's a good trade. Hey, I do want to say that if you smoke cigars, and my Uncle Daryl, who I believe is watching, would want me to say don't. But if you do, there is no finer ashtray in America today than the Louder with Crowder mug. It's worth becoming a member of the Mug Club. And believe me, it pains me to recommend the Mug Club, but it is worth becoming a member of the Mug Club to have so fine an ashtray.
That is so good. I love it.
And you can take
I'll do it. All right. So who do you see on the horizon? So, you kind of got your eye out there. Is there anybody we should be watching for that and sharing and posting about to help spread the word about that you think will help communicate conservative values to this next generation?
I'll tell you this. One thing you have to, I think part of the reason that Ben has been so successful, he took the least popular position you could take in the election. He didn't support Donald Trump for the presidency. And, this is another, we were told, and we even thought it's possible that Ben won't have a career after Trump ascends the presidency because of the position that we both took, but he is a public figure. We found the exact opposite to be true. His audience exploded. Why? It's not because he's anti-Trump, and he isn't anti-Trump. Ben didn't vote for the president. I can't speak for him. I think he might vote for the president if the election were today. Certainly his perspective, like all of our perspectives, changes and evolves in time, and the reality on the ground changes and evolves over time.
Well, and sorry to interrupt you, but I mean,
No,
he is
please.
definitely, from what I've seen, he's given the president props when deserved, and still
Absolutely.
takes him to task when deserved. So the audience, it's that same authenticity you were talking about.
That's exactly right. The reason I believe that Ben has done so well is because he isn't perceived as a partisan hack.
Yeah.
People believe 20% of our audience is left. And they'll stop us on the streets and say, I hate everything you say, but I'm always fascinated to hear it. I love to hear it.
Wow.
I think the reason they're drawn to Ben is because I think they're getting an honest broker, someone who's going to tell them exactly what he thinks and why. He isn't playing politics. He isn't dancing, tap dancing. And I think that is another piece of advice that I would give to young people. Don't, if you want to be a politician, you probably have to figure out what people want and try to sell it to them. But if you're going to be if you're going to be an authentic person over time, if you're going to be an important voice over time, I'm not saying to be rigid, and I'm not saying to be uncompromising, but I am saying you have to figure out what is it that you believe, not what is it that you think you believe, not what talking points have you memorized, not what does your mom or dad believe, not what do your friends believe. What do you actually believe? Where are you actually willing to stand? Ben was willing to lose his career over the position that he took in the election, if that's what the price was. That's not what the price was. The truth is that the audience really responded to that level of authenticity. But it's an important question to ask yourself if you're going into public life. What are you willing to give it all up for? And for Ben, it's the truth. And I would modify that slightly and say the truth as he sees it. I think he would too, because he doesn't have he doesn't have a unique claim to the truth, and he's not right all the time. But he does make informed decisions, and he stands by them. And so
I want to get that's good. I want to get to some of the questions we're getting for them, but I got one more for you, because you kind of mentioned the difference in some of our graduates obviously are already in politics. Some of them want to be more in this culture influence area of either a Hollywood type thing or commentary like what you and others do. So, speak to that a little bit, because it seems to me you can actually have more influence as a culture influencer, commentator, outside of being an actual elected official, than you can being one person in an elected office. How do you feel about that? I mean, obviously we need people in both, but these folks that are on tonight, they kind of have options, right? I mean, they could go in multiple directions if they're good at this craft. So there again, how do you decide?
Political power is actual power, but it is constrained power. And what I mean by that is that politicians have to function within certain boundaries that have been established by the culture. So the classic example of this is when Barack Obama ran for the presidency in 2008. He ran opposed to same-sex marriage. And I'm reluctant to even use the term same-sex marriage for a variety of reasons, but it's late in the day. I've been at work, and my mind's not as sharp as it usually is.
And you're only halfway through your cigar, so your relaxation is not quite there. Yeah.
So obviously, I think that the modifier same-sex means it's not marriage, like all left-wing modifiers, right? Like political correctness is not correctness, and social justice is not justice, and same-sex marriage is not marriage. And that's not, listen, I'm pretty libertarian on these things, live and let live. I think that people ought to be able to enter into whatever kind of contractual unions that they want to enter into, but marriage has always been the union of husbands and wives, right? That's a tangent. But Barack Obama had to be publicly opposed to, officially opposed to same-sex marriage during his first campaign. 4 short years later, he had to be for same-sex marriage in order to win re-election from the same party. Well, what changed? Well, what changed is the boundaries between which politicians are able to function had moved because the culture moved. Barack Obama could not be president in 2008 if he had run in favor and support of same-sex marriage. So that tells me that the culture actually sets the boundaries between which have to live both parties, has to live all elected officials, and has to express all political power. Who shapes the culture? Well, that's a big question, but certainly influencers are a major part of shaping the culture. Writers, thinkers, speakers, actors, musicians. These are the people who basically create the framework in which politicians have to operate. Now, they have actual power, but wouldn't you also say that the people shaping the boundaries have an enormous amount of power? Yeah, I think that there's more need for conservatives to operate in culture. We do very well in government, actually. We control the majority of the states. We control two chambers of Congress right now, the presidency, and arguably our voice is the loudest on the Supreme Court as well. So why do we always feel like we're losing the country? Because we've forfeited the culture. And so the boundaries between which we're able to affect policy keep moving to the this is your left, right?
Yeah.
Keep moving to the left. So it's not
Yeah.
possible to be as conservative today as a politician as it was in the 1980s. You simply can't do it.
Yeah, it's that what Glenn calls it, what the Overton window. You know,
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It just keeps moving. Yeah, yeah. So we need more influencers in you know, the pulpit, in Hollywood, in education, and all of these different areas. But
all of it is fraught with peril. I said this when I was with you guys in Austin last year, and I never want to go too far without saying it, especially to young people, because it's I feel like very few people, you know, I can still remember being young. It wasn't just the other day, but it wasn't too long ago. And very few people warn you about the dangers of advocating for your values. You know, most people say you should advocate for your values. You should get out there and change the world. But you know, Moses didn't get to enter the land of promise. I mean, arguably he did in the end. But now we're getting a little new covenanty. Right. He didn't as a living, breathing man get to enter the land of promise, because there's a price to wielding power. There's a price to wielding fame and influence. There's a power to wielding wealth. They take their toll on you. They change you, not for the better. People who are, you know, we need people who will wield them. But you're going to take some scars, take some bumps, and take some bruises on that path. And I think you really do have to ask yourself, you have to be honest with yourself about what it means. You won't be the one guy who manages to live a middle-class life on a upper-class income, because wealth does change you. You might be far more successful at maintaining middle-class values if you're a Dave Ramsey, for example. But Dave Ramsey isn't unaffected by his success. He isn't unaffected by his wealth. No one is. And you know, people who go to war come back with scars. We need people to go to war. But you should be honest with yourself about what it's going to entail, about the price you're going to pay.
It's going in eyes wide open, basically, and almost, even though you can't calculate it exactly, you're making that decision just as the founders did when they signed. They knew what they were signing. They knew what they were getting into. In the same way for these young people, if you're choosing a career that's going to put it all out there and put yourself on the line, whether as a public figure or even if you're, you know, behind the scenes helping to mold and to shape, those things still do not leave you unscarred, for sure.
That's right.
Let's talk about just that attitude a little bit, because the left seems relentless. We want to be able to, you know, go enjoy our freedom and our families and all of those things. The left seems to never stop fighting. Frank asks the question, basically, how do you keep from burning out physically and mentally? How do you stay inspired when you're in the fight like you are, at the level that you are? It's even more intense. So what do you do to rejuvenate yourself in addition to no, wait, you didn't say Monte Cristo. What did you say? Yeah, you said it was a Monte
Cristo.
Yeah, okay. In addition to that, how do you stay in the fight without getting worn out?
Yeah, so I'll tell you three things, and there's a fourth in my own life that I've discovered. One of them is, and it takes a little seasoning before you'll see this, but if you stay in the fight long enough, you will. You have to realize that it is not your job to save the world. It's not your job to change the world. It's not your job to save America. It's not your job to save the Constitution. It's not your job to save conservatism. None of that is your job. That job belongs to one, and he's got it in hand. You know, it's not you. When my friend Andrew Breitbart wrote his book, Righteous Indignation, Excuse Me While I Save the World, I think was the subtitle. And I cautioned him against that subtitle. I said, Andrew, this is dangerous, because it sets yourself up for the greatest failure. It defines your life by the unaccomplishable, and it vests a power and responsibility in you that no man can actually maintain. You know, our job is to walk in faith. Sometimes walking in faith means being the bad example. We never want to face that about ourselves. Quite often in life, and I think this is one of the things you realize as you get older too, quite often we think we want to be the ones that God points to and says, man, you need to be like Jeremy. Far more often, you're the one that God points to and says, aren't you glad you're not like Jeremy? Or you
Amen.
better not be like Jeremy. Right?
Amen. Amen, brother.
And we have to accept that in God's grace is the freedom to fail and is the freedom to be wrong.
Yeah.
That he's not, if he wanted to hold us to an absolute standard of rightness, he could. We would be the ones we would have no access to him if that were the mechanism. He instead condescended, right? He came down and met us where we are, took our unrighteousness on himself. He who knew no sin became sin so that we might be the righteousness of God in him. That is the only truth that you can live your life by. And if you live your life by that truth, then you realize, I'm not trying to save America. I'm not trying to save the country. I'm not trying to change the world. All I'm doing is putting one foot in front of the other. I'm living to the best of my ability, which is highly flawed, consistent with a set of values that I believe to be true. They might not all even be true. It's not given to me to even know that. I do my best, and I trust a God who's got it in hand, got me in hand, is bigger than my failures, is bigger than the things that I know or don't know, the things that I do or don't do. And that's given me a freedom to try, because I don't feel that trying has to equate to succeeding.
Yeah.
The second piece of that is
before you go to the second one, I got to say, this is why I love being around guys like you and David Barton. Y'all have such a John Quincy Adams, duty is ours, results are God's attitude, and it's almost like an even kill. Whereas some of us, we do too much high, too much low. You guys have that even kill because of that recognition that God is sovereign. I'm just here to be faithful, do my duty. It's not all on my shoulders. I'm to do the best I can, but my worth and my certainly, my eternal hope is not in the results that I get. Those are certainly God's. That's what I'm hearing from you, and I hope our viewers tonight are as well. Go ahead. Sorry, number two.
Number two is surround yourself with people who know that to be true.
Yeah.
And it's so easy in politics to get swept up in the fight, to get swept up in the stakes. Listen, the stakes are real. We all know them. When Nancy Pelosi says somebody saving a middle-class person saving $1,000 on their taxes is no big deal, or whatever her quote was, we know that's not true. We know that to someone making $30,000 to $60,000 a year, you're talking about a significant portion of their income, especially a significant portion of their income after they pay taxes. We know that, sometimes I think about government programs this way. Like someone will say, they spent, it wasn't that much money. We spent $12 million on that thing and it didn't work. Or we spent $12 million on that test and it didn't work. And I think, my father will work his entire life, every single day of his adult life, and never, every dollar of taxes he ever contributes to the government will not pay for that little thing that seems like no big deal to you. If you think about a big program where money gets wasted, all of our fathers will work their entire lives, or generations of our fathers could work their entire lives to pay for this stuff. Those are real stakes. If you contribute $1 million in taxes across your middle-class working life, the government owes you better than to squander that $1 million. So we know the stakes are real. And by the way, those are the lightest of stakes. People actually die from policy. People are sent abroad, forsaken, killed. People have their self-worth and they're destroyed by these social welfare programs. They have their view of themselves in relation to their fellow man polluted. They're turned against people, turned against them. These are real stakes.
They're real stakes. And an example from the first part of our conversation, when government takes away your right to defend, you end up with, the stories of women being raped or murdered or whatever when their gun was, 50 feet away in the truck, but they weren't allowed to have it on campus. So it's just another example of these policies affect lives.
That's right. And yet, you cannot allow yourself to get swept up in thinking it's on you to change the world. And so, step one, realize that to be true. Step two, surround yourself with other people who know that to be true. Not people who are apathetic,
Right,
not
right.
people who are complacent, but people who realize that the outcome isn't in our hands, that our job is to do what we can do,
Yeah.
because the people you surround yourself with are really going to define the course of your life. You
Right.
know, people, they've done studies that prove people act consistent with cultural values more than with their own deeply held values. So it actually, over the course of your life, what you believe deeply will have less of an impact on the course of your own life than what your community believes deeply. Because when we fail, we fail within those sort of parameters that are defined for us by culture as well. And culture for us is much smaller than national culture. It's the people that we surround ourselves with, the people in our lives.
That's right. Our executive director, Nathan Macias, and also a state rep, former state rep, but he was saying the same thing to me the other day. You know, who are those 2 or 3, 4 people that a young man puts in their lives that they spend their time with, or a young woman? That is going to determine who they become 30, 40. It's not just your spouse; it's those people that you're allowing to influence you on a daily basis. You just nailed it, man. I don't think we tell young people that enough.
Yeah. And number 3, and this one will be the hardest pill to swallow. I've arrived at a place now where I don't care that much about politics. And I know that's a funny thing to say because my entire life really is caught up in trying to affect political change, right? I publish a political website. I produce political shows. I have meetings at the White House, or I interact with campaigns. I know senators and I know congressmen. I've met, every luminary in the movement and have deep relationships, and I'm devoted to it. But I've come to see it really as a job. And I don't mean a job in the sense of like, you don't like it when your congressman gets too used to making all the money or whatever. Although whether or not congressmen actually make a lot of money is subject to debate. But, this idea that they're just in it for they're in it to go to the cocktail party. They're in it to I get that. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I go to work and then I go home. I want to run a successful company. I don't want to run an unsuccessful company. I'm not content I'm not one of these guys who says, I'm willing to lose everything for the movement. What's the movement? The movement's not willing to lose everything for me. The world is about people and not institutions, even the most important institutions. And I think America is about the most important institution besides the church that the world has ever known. But the irony of it is, or maybe the paradox of it is, that we serve the whole by serving the individual. That's one of the amazing things about our actual belief system. And it's very easy to forget our core beliefs when we're out fighting for our core beliefs every day. It's very easy to think what we need to do is amass political power. But isn't our core belief that no one should amass political power? Political power shouldn't be amassed. So what I mean is, in the same way that the best way to have a healthy national economy is to make sure that the individual gets to keep their money, that the individual gets to take risks, that the individual gets to succeed and the individual gets to fail. In the same way, the best way to save our country is to live a happy life. The best way to save our country is to get married, to have children, to make more money than you spend, to teach other people to get married and have children and make more money than they spend, to find your joy not in these abstract things like, I'll just tell you, I've always had a problem, and I like to say controversial things whenever I'm with you, Rick. I've never liked people. I've never liked people giving a lot of money to charities like to feed people in Africa. And it's not that I don't think people in Africa need help. They do. But what bothers me is that sometimes it's very easy to give money to people who are starving in Africa because they aren't real people to you. But it's very hard to help the people you know. It's hard to help your neighbor. It's hard to help your friend because you can actually see all the bad choices that they make. But when you think about the nameless, faceless other in some distant continent, you don't have to actually think about their true humanity, about their culpability in their station, about the government's culpability in their station. And so it's very easy sometimes to sort of virtue signal to ourselves by helping people we don't know. Very hard to help the individual we do. Um, we have to help the individuals we do know. And we have to be the individuals we help the most have to be the ones we know the most. So that's my third one, is live a productive, faithful, happy life. You know, it is possible that when you give money to that charity in Africa, that money is actually used to oppress the very people you're trying to help. You know, you don't know because it's so far removed from you. You just don't know. It's possible that national health care is better than free market health care. You don't know. You think, and I agree with what you think. You know, we've put in the intellectual work. We've observed the countries around us that have done the wrong, you know, what we consider to be the wrong thing. But the truth is, the effect of policy across time and millions upon millions of people, we have brains the size of cantaloupes. You have to start by helping you, your family, the people around you. When you do that, there is a cumulative effect of that that's going to expand outward and have a greater impact on the world than your sort of political and policy ambitions.
That's
and I
so
said
good.
there's 3 plus 1.
Yeah.
The plus 1 is just the gospel, right? The plus 1 is, by what mechanism do we help the people around us? By what mechanism do we help ourselves? By what mechanism do we live a happy and productive and faithful life? By what mechanism are we able to take the burden off of ourselves for changing the world? By what mechanism do we prioritize the right things and not the wrong things? And that's by the mechanism of Christ. Through the faith of Christ, we have access to peace, and peace is actually where our hope is, not accomplishment or ambition or any of these other things that we sometimes chase.
Well, you're even better than you realize, because that was the last question I was going to ask, because I promised you an hour, so we're already a minute over here. But one of the last question in the chat was to the church and how the church can once again have that positive influence on the culture and shape the culture in the right way and do the things you're talking about. And maybe the answer is what you just said, that it begins with us in our local churches, making sure we're doing the very things that we're saying the whole country and the world should be doing.
Prioritizing the individual and the individual's relationship with Christ. And you ask about the church, and I do want to speak to that for a moment, because, you know, I don't say this to be glib, but what is the church? Right? This is something we've all asked, but in this context, it's an important question. You know, I've been teaching out of the book of Acts the last few weeks, and it's a new thing for me. I just finished a 6-year teaching that was a harmony of the 4 Gospels. It's the biggest intellectual work I've ever undertaken. And when it was over, I was, as you often are after you finish a massive project, I was deflated and a little depressed and sullen and kind of in the wilderness. I didn't know where to go next, you know, and I didn't want to start some major new undertaking. I just wasn't emotionally or spiritually prepared for that. And so when it came time for the next teaching, I just opened up Acts. I said, well, we're just going to keep sort of following these guys until the inspiration comes along. And so, you know, we've spent the last few weeks in Acts 2 and 3, which is the very beginning of the church. And it's an amazing thing to contemplate. On the first day of the church, there is no one in the church, including the apostles, who has sound theology. They don't know anything, right? I mean, Peter, on the day of Pentecost, does not know that the gospel is for the Gentiles. On the second day of the church, he doesn't know. Men of Israel, he says in his famous Pentecost speech, this Jesus whom you have crucified, God has raised. The second public speech, he speaks to the lame man, who I like to call the leaping man, because I don't like to identify him by what he was. I like to identify him by what he becomes.
That's good.
Right?
I love
leaping man. And he says the same thing when he speaks to the people after that. He says, men of Israel. Why does he keep saying men of Israel? Because that's the only men there are in the church. The only men he's presenting the gospel to, the only men who are accepting the gospel, are men of Israel. On the third day of the church, and the fourth day of the church, on the third week, and the fourth week, on the third month, Peter doesn't even know that you can be a Christian and not first be Jewish. So that teaches me something about the nature of the church, that the church isn't about being right. It's not about having perfect theology, a perfect grasp on every wrinkle of truth, of every wrinkle of doctrine. The second thing about the church that's interesting in those early chapters is that they're wrong about social policy. They have all things in common. They sell their property. They take care of each other, right? Those verses in Acts 2 and later in Acts 4 and 5 became sort of the foundation for early communism. Millions of people died because of badly interpreting those verses. The Plymouth colony almost destroyed itself because of an adherence to those verses, which William Bradford goes on to, that's who it is, yes? Goes on to say, we sought to be smarter than God. You know, we sought to outsmart God. But they were using the Bible to outsmart God. But they didn't read later when Paul writes in his epistle to people who have misinterpreted those early Acts verses, if you do not work, you shall not eat. Be busy about your work, not being busybodies.
Yeah.
So in other words, even the early church misunderstood the early church and had to be rebuked by Paul, right? So they weren't right about doctrine. They weren't right about politics. They weren't right about social policy. All they really had in common was that they shared in the Spirit, they came together to hear the teachings of the apostles, and they gave praise and glory to God. The church wasn't an international institution. It wasn't a big C church. It was just the called out ones. And the very word, the called out one, speaks to individuals.
Yeah.
So what is the church? The church, in this case, it matters. How does the church affect the greatest change? It has to stop trying to be more than the church. It has to content itself with being the church, the body of believers united in one thing, and that's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if we make that our focus instead of all these other things our focus, again, it's a lot like the invisible hand of the market. The truth of the gospel is a lot like the invisible hand of the market. A lot of wisdom is this way, that when you try to do, you fail. When you focus instead on those first principles, when you focus instead on the small, the individual, the close, the true, the ripple out cumulative effect of that actually creates the change that you, through all of your effort, could never have accomplished.
That is almost Yoda-like there, man. I mean, that was good. That was really good because
later I'm going to blow up the tree with lightning and.
I'm serious. I've never thought about that analogy though of the invisible hand of the market, and it's the same way. I mean, if we're individually doing what Christ told us to do and lifting up Christ, and we're serving our fellow men, and we're being good citizens, we're doing all the things that that we're told to do to be a good Christ follower, the church will do its job.
Right.
I hate keeping you long, but I got to ask you one more question because it's such a good one. Do you mind? Okay, so Aaron asked about the university situation right now and how we are funding the left by funding the public universities and how hostile they've become. What is happening in our movement to try to change that and to defund the public universities and get a more market-oriented, college solution?
Not enough. I completely agree with Aaron. I think that one of the worst things happening in our culture today is that conservative parents spend all of their money and unearned money still yet unearned by their children.
That's right.
To send them to a place that exists to destroy all the values that they inculcated in those children across the course of their upbringing. You know, I know a lot of Christian parents who are like that. We don't let our kids date; they have to court. Or Christian parents who are like, we don't let our kids use the internet unsupervised. Or Christian parents who, we don't let our kids have cell phones. They take all of these somewhat drastic steps to protect their children. And then the day they graduate high school, they spend their life savings to send that child to a public university that exists to not just unmake those safeguards you put in place, but utterly destroy them.
But Jeremy, but it's the school with the best football team, and we've been wearing their sweatshirts all our life, and seriously, we do that. We send our kids because of sports or whatever, because it's the popular.
But we also send our kids because of a bad idea, right? And the bad idea is that in order to be successful in today's connected, technologically advanced society, you have to have this calling card, which is why I proudly say there's nothing cheap about a Monte Cristo añejado. And I have many Monte Cristo añejados, What I don't have is a college degree. Don't believe the lie that college is the only pathway to success.
Yeah.
There are kinds of success that can only be attained through college. Absolutely. You know, if you were to come to me and say, Jeremy, I really feel like I'm called to be a brain surgeon. I don't have any formal education, but I think if I just cut into you, I could really
Right.
intuit my way through
Right.
risk and reward. I'm going to get there. Get back to me in 500 bodies.
Right.
Of course, there's a place for higher education, but the lie that became in vogue in the 80s and 90s, I think, is that there is no path apart from college, or that any degree from college is a path to those kinds of success, and it's simply not true. What's going to determine your professional success, your monetary success in life, is actually, and Ben loves to talk about this, it's some very small ball practical things. According to Ben and Brookings, I believe is who it's from, don't have children out of wedlock, get a high school diploma. There's a third, which it is escaping me at the moment, but high school diploma, don't have kids out of wedlock, whatever
Don't
the
get
third one is.
divorced.
You won't be permanently poor in America. I would add a couple of other very simple things to that formula. Don't do drugs, which I've seen in my own life, and probably many of us have, just destroy entire families. And the worst thing about drugs is they don't always destroy entire families, which gives us a false sense of security, I think, when we're young and restless and reckless, to think that we can get away with more than we can. And here's one that they don't teach you early enough: compound interest. Don't spend more than you make. If you spend less than you make and you put that money in places for this compound interest, and you don't have kids before you're married, you're going to be fine. I would put another huge one, which is get married. So, all that stuff in the Bible about don't have sex until you're married, right? Which is a big Christian sort of value. That wasn't meant to keep you from having sex. It was meant to keep you from staying single.
That's right.
God wants you to be married. Marriage is the picture of our relationship with God in Christ. And I don't know a single man that I've ever known who didn't immediately start making 2 times more money as soon as they get married, because marriage does something fundamental and important in your life. But if you do those things, you're going to be fine. Take risks, fail, give yourself the freedom to take risks and the freedom to fail. Give yourself the opportunity to learn from failure. And if you are one of the people who, feels called to be a surgeon, or feels called to work in advanced mathematics and engineering, if you're one of the people who feels called to law, of course there are reasons for you to pursue a degree. If you're not, pursue the things that will actually empower you on your path. I met recently with Ivanka Trump, which was a real kick for me. And she's not the most conservative person you've ever met by political policy sort of metrics, but she feels a passion for advancing the cause of trade schools.
Yeah.
She feels, and I really responded to this, and she said, people accuse me of not being conservative. This is a fundamentally conservative position that no one gives me credit for.
Yeah.
And she's right. So I don't think you should let systems determine your future. College is a system. Systems exist to serve us. We don't exist to serve systems. And you're still somehow, by the grace of God, if you're in this country today, you are still a free man or a free woman, and you should exercise that freedom and carve out your own path, and you'll be fine. You don't have to.
You're right. You are free if you live in Texas and not California, but somewhat free if you're in California. Yeah. And what you just described. I mean, Peter Thiel, PayPal founder, spoke at the convention, all this stuff. He says the same thing. He says it's a con game. It's an absolute con game that they've managed. They've managed to con the whole country into thinking you have to have this degree and you have to go through us to get it, and you can't be successful without it. And you're right. In certain professions, that is true. I even think in the legal profession, they've created that passport, if you will, to get there, where the founders didn't have it that way. You go apprentice with someone and learn the law, and if you can pass the bar, you ought to be able to practice. I hope we'll move that direction in the legal field. I agree with you on brain surgery. definitely want them to get through 500 before they get to me for sure.
Yeah,
Jeremy, you've been gracious. You've given us more time than I had asked for, and I can't thank you enough. This has been a blast. I hope you'll do it with us again. And next time, I will have the computer set up outside around the fire, and the boys and I will have our cigars out, and we will smoke with you as we share. And your aunt right now, I'm sure, is going, oh, the influence of Jeremy on Rick. I don't know if I can allow
I'm being disowned as we speak by people who are very dear to me. Listen, I love Patriot Academy. It's always a real kick for me and an honor to get to talk. Again, I'm always inspired really by the caliber and quality of young people who are a part of what you're doing. And if you didn't hear it at the beginning, I've actually recently hired a alum of Patriot Academy in Colton Haas, and pretty much the only thing I knew about him is that he was one of your guys. And I thought, well, that's pretty high recommendation to me.
Well, we're glad he's with you, by the way. So that's good. Tell Governor Haas to represent us well. And have you trained him well on those Monte Cristos yet? Is that?
I feel like he needs to be with the company at least 3 more months before I let him have a Monte Cristo.
Good call. Jeremy, bless you, brother. God bless you, and thanks so much for tonight, man. Appreciate you being on with us.
Thank you.
Patriots, thanks for joining us tonight. We'll hopefully have our technology working a little better next month, but we'll also have this recorded, and you can share it with the other Patriots as well. We'll send out that link as soon as we're done. God bless, brother. We'll see you later.